Last thing we'll do in this session is talk about a couple of types of covenants that will help us as we move through our sessions together, particularly the next session as we come to Scripture and start looking at the 6 major covenants that God has enacted with human beings. We'll notice that some of God's covenants are different depending on what God's wanting to do in those covenants. And to be able to understand them well, we have to have some categories to work with. A couple of different types of covenants and how we can make sense, better sense out of the Bible. The first category answers this question: who has the power to define and to design the covenant? Who has the power to define and design the covenant? Now, there's 2 types of covenants with regard to this question. One type is called unilateral, one type is called bilateral. In a unilateral covenant, one person, one party, has more power in the relationship. You'd call them, in some sense, the more superior partner in terms of authority or ability to implement the nature of this covenant. Think perhaps, think of the best example of this, which is when God enters into covenant with us. God is always the more powerful party. He's the creator, we're just creatures. It's not a bad thing, it's just naming what's true. And so, in every one of God's covenants, those covenants are unilateral, meaning that one party has the authority to both define and design the covenant. All of God's covenants are unilateral. He doesn't come to us and sort of negotiate with us or ask us to sort of create half the covenant. He designs the covenant and then offers it to us. Now, we still have the choice of entering or not. He never forces covenant, but his covenants are unilaterally designed and defined and then offered to us as his covenant partners. Other sort of covenantal relationships like that would be, say, something like the covenantal relationship that, say, a nation makes with its citizens. It's the government or the leaders who get to sort of name, this often being more contractual than covenantal, name the laws, and the citizens simply agree either to be a citizen of that country and participate, or they leave. But they can't get in and tell the government that they're going to enact different laws. There's a governmental process for that, right? Or you think of adoption, another covenantal relationship where parents bring a non-biological youngster into their family. That's a pretty unilateral relationship. When you bring an infant in, the infant doesn't have a lot to say about that relationship, but they are being loved and embraced. It's just a unilateral covenant. So one type is unilateral. Bilateral is the other type. Bilateral covenants are those where both parties have roughly equal power, and therefore there's mutual design and definition and together creating this covenant. I think marriage is it should be a good example of this, where there's equality between the partners, and they talk together about what will our marriage look like? What will it mean? What does love look like for us as a couple? A friendship covenant would be another example of a bilateral covenant where 2 friends sit down together and sort of talk together about what their covenant will look like. So, always this question: who has the power to design and implement the covenant? Either unilateral, one party, or bilateral, both parties negotiating together. Another question that raises the fact of different types of covenants is this: if someone breaks the covenant, what happens, and can this covenant be terminated? That's an interesting question. So there's a difference in covenants between breaking and terminating a covenant. Breaking a covenant just means that one of the terms of the covenant has been violated by somebody. Now, if the covenant's been broken, that means there's been damage to the relationship. That doesn't necessarily mean that the covenant is terminated. It might mean that, but it doesn't have to mean that. This gets us to another difference of 2 types of covenants: conditional and unconditional. Okay? In an unconditional covenant, the parties both promise that whether the partner breaks it or not, they will always be faithful to the covenant. It's an unconditional covenant. There's no condition, including breaking it, that can end that covenant. It's really important to know if one is entering into an unconditional or a conditional covenant. In a conditional covenant, there are conditions that if they happen, that covenant can be terminated, as in it is no longer. We're going to see, as we move through the scriptures and God's covenants, that sometimes God makes conditional covenants, sometimes he makes unconditional covenants. And he's very wise about which he does when. I'd propose that we have to follow God in wisdom here. We have to know, every time we go into a covenant, are we entering it conditionally or unconditionally? If it's broken, what's the appropriate response? Mercy and forgiveness? Or can the relationship actually come to an end? These are all covenantal questions that have to do with different kinds of covenants. This is often in our culture, because we're not clear about covenants, often we're not clear when a terminated covenant happens, or should it happen, or does breaking mean termination, or should we forgive? These are the things that practically we'll be getting into as we walk through human covenants in all their various types and styles, and what God calls his kingdom people to do in these various relationships.